mostly what I talk about are the things that go wrong for our children. And so for me, it's such a pleasure. I mean, as I got acquainted with what you guys are doing here, I felt suddenly a sense of hope that we can make a difference, in the way we treat, children who are removed from their home for no fault of their own because of neglect and abuse. So, there's no point in me talking to you about what you already know, which is why our kids are thrown into the system and how the system is failing them. But what I can talk to you about is why I got involved and why I wrote the book, and what I would like all of you to think about in terms of some leaders and legislations that we have coming up that are very important to the future of our children, and perhaps all of you can pass the word and get involved and see if there's a way of all of us starting to work together across the nation, instead of all these pockets of people who really do care and really do the right job, but haven't gotten together to create an impact that's everlasting. So, we all know that our children are the most voiceless, vulnerable children in our country. In fact, to think that I came to America because my grandfather used to always talk about the Statue of Liberty and tell me, quote, "Give me your poo and you huddled as long as they believe in freedom." And I came here believing in America, believing the American dream was going to be my dream. And it has been, quite frankly, and I have achieved tremendous success in many areas. But no matter where I went and how much success I actually achieved, there was always a little thing inside of me that I'm sure you all felt, which is that little depression that says, is that all there is that comes along with success? And I really didn't start walking with my destiny until I met a little girl who was 5.5 years old, who was living in a homeless mission. It was the Sunlight Mission on 14th Street in Santa Monica. And it was my first experience of actually going somewhere. Before that, I used to write checks, donations, but I never had that hands-on experience. And somehow, I think, our destiny is such that it leads us in directions that we don't quite understand. But somehow, my destiny led me to this homeless mission, and I wanted to see what it was really like for these children. There were 120 children living in this homeless mission. A lot of them were living with their battered mothers who came from domestic abuse, and a lot of them were living with crack moms who were abusing them. And there were no fathers there except one, I think. Well, I brought some friends with me, and as I was walking through the mission, and we went upstairs, and that was the living area, and I went into little cubicles, and each cubicle had 3 cots that were covered by sheets that were sort of strung like curtains, and in each cot there was a mom, sometimes with 1 child, sometimes with 2 children, sleeping there at night. And I remember my manager walking behind me and saying, "There, but for the grace of God, go us." And it was that one sentence that I have never forgotten. And as I was taken downstairs, we walked through the kitchen that fed thousands of homeless people with hot meal every day. I saw a little girl sleeping on the bench in the kitchen, in the stench and the steam and the oil. And as I passed by, you know, I looked at her, and her hair was dreadlocked, so I couldn't tell the color of her hair. And her face was caked, like a lot of homeless kids are, and I couldn't tell the color of her skin. And as I passed by, her eyes flared up and opened, and these green, amazing eyes with lots of piercing energy looked at me. And she jumped off the bench and she grabbed my hand. And that was that moment that changed my destiny, because today she's my daughter. And through her, she was already in 15 foster homes by the time she was 5.5. She was living with her crack mom in the homeless mission. Her crack mom was selling her. There was another section of the homeless mission which was men, and she was selling her to the men to play with sexually for $1 each. I had no idea when I met her that this was the life she was leading. But from the moment she grabbed my hand, I couldn't turn my back. And I decided to come back. And I started coming back every weekend. And I realized that at 5.5, she wasn't even toilet trained. And she'd never been to school and didn't even know the ABCs. And so I started teaching her, but every time I came back, she would have bruises on her and sometimes cuts. And I realized that she was being hurt on a continuous level, so I called the emergency line. I didn't know what else to do at the time. And nobody called me back. And if you knew me, like Beverly knows me, I'm not the kind of person you don't call back. And so I called one of the supervisors in the counties there, Yaroslavsky, and I told him, I said, you know, there's a little girl here, she's being abused, and I don't know, nobody's calling me back. So the next day, miraculously, a social worker appeared on the scene and found out that Michelle wasn't even going to school, and started getting involved. But getting involved meant, for me, being exposed to the court system and the juvenile justice system. And what I recognized very quickly is that there was no system that really protected our children. By then we found out that it was the crack mom that was hurting Michelle. And when I asked her about it, she said, oh, she's just really clumsy. She falls down the stairs all the time. Michelle had a habit of escaping the abuse by defecating in her pants. And she would hide under the building. She was living 14 blocks from the ocean and had never seen the ocean. And one day they called me up in the middle of the night and they told me that Michelle was choked to death. She was rushed to Santa Monica Hospital, and so did I. I rushed there. She was revived, and I went to court with her after that, and Judge Garcia gave her crack mom parenting classes. And I said, over my dead body. And I was found in contempt of court. And just before my arraignment and the court, I had sent a fax to everybody on the Hill. And that next night, First Lady Hillary Clinton called me. And she came to Los Angeles and went to court with me. Well, needless to say that they didn't find me guilty. And miraculously, Michelle was then taken to court again for parental termination case. And what happened was, it was during the time that family preservation was really the priority of the law. And so biological parents, even if they were the abusers, were given the priority in terms of how the children were being handled. But it was so interesting, yet debilitating, to see that the courts were leaning towards abuse being somewhat overlooked. And then I realized that we were all subject to something called FERPA, which I'm sure you're all very aware of, which is the confidentiality clause for juveniles that eliminates from using the information to prosecute the abusers. To today, 15 out of 16 abusers go without spending 1 day in jail. 15 out of 16 rapists go without spending 1 day in jail. It was then that I decided, and I promised Michelle, that I will never turn my back on any child in the system. And I started diligently working on creating with Hillary Clinton Children Uniting Nations, which is an organization that focuses predominantly in introducing caring adults who are not paid to be there into the lives of these children and training them as academic mentors, life skill mentors, and occupational mentors. Now, all of you know how incredibly important that is. And by virtue of needing to recruit, we didn't realize how hard it was to recruit volunteers. We started something called the Day of the Child, which is a day that Beverly was involved in, and she can tell you a little bit about this. But it's a day that we actually host thousands of foster children, and each one of them is matched with a mentor that we already cleared and did the background checks and trained. And so, although this is a one day, it gives our mentors a chance to connect with one child and eliminate this veil of these kids are monsters, which is most of our foster kids have suffered from. And enable the kids to also have one person lock eyes with them. What I have learned over the years is that nobody ever remembers these children's birthday, which is why I love your birthday closet. And nobody ever makes eye contact with them because they're usually talked to in groups. And so these children often tell me, as they grow to be teens, that they feel disposable. And that is something that I wanted to eliminate by creating an awareness as to how much these children need us and how much we need them, because 78.8% of all inmates in penitentiaries come from the child welfare system, which means that instead of breeding contributing educated citizens, we are breeding criminals. Because at 18 years old, without any life skills and without education, these children are thrown onto the streets with no support system. And therefore their only alternatives are drugs and crime and human trafficking, which is a part of what I really also want to talk to you about. So, lo and behold, we created this. I became a commissioner. We created the Inter-Council Agency for Abused and Neglected Children, which we brought every head of every government department that has anything to do with abused children onto one table. So the right hand started to know what the left hand is doing, which I'm sure you tackle every day, the fact that nobody knows what's really happening. And consequently, we were able to force the governor to pay attention.
Crystal, please come down to the TTC. Crystal, come to the TTC. Thank you.
You know, I don't know if Crystal is here, but that must be you. So we were able to get probation, you know, sheriff department, juvenile court, the Judge Nash, LAUSD, everybody in one table. And so together we started creating the best practices guidelines for mentoring and how we were as a community going to become a family to these children. David Sanders was then, Dr. David Sanders was then the head of the DCFS. And with him at the table, it enabled us to actually increase the focus of training teens and creating kinship care as a priority, but also reforming some of the ideas in terms of residential group homes, foster homes, etc. And creating an understanding as to what happens. It was at that point that I noticed, because by then I had already, I adopted Michelle, I adopted Ashley, who was a crack baby, and I was also a mentor to 3 other foster kids. And I noticed with all of them that they all had some major cognitive issues. And so I started working with Dr. Hakimi, and after a while I reached out to Dr. Victoria Stevens, who's the #1 expert on education and neurobiology in the country. And we invested a lot with UCLA and Harvard and other universities to research what actually happens when a foster child is removed from their home and start being moved around. And what we found is that it causes trauma to the middle vortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain that suppresses the cognitive abilities of children, but also the judgment area. So we started recognizing that the behavior problems are actually attached somewhat to a difficulty that the brain has in protecting itself. And just in simple language, I'll explain a little bit to you. When the brain is actually combining of, brain waves, which go through synapses. And the positive charge actually goes through here, but there's a fluid here, which is a negative charge, which enables the brain wave to go, which is electricity, to go to the other side. The brain, to protect itself from abuse and any kind of emotional trauma, which is more painful than physical trauma, changes that fluid to a positive charge, which repels the brain wave that carries the emotional pain. So therefore, our children temporarily defend themselves from emotional pain by eliminating the passage through. It's the body's way of reacting appropriately. And when a child is subjected to emotional intelligence, the child is actually able to adjust and therefore start feeling better about what's happening in their life, and the synapse actually correct itself and the brain waves start flowing through. Unfortunately, our scientists have realized that, and many of our children, in fact 60% of our students nationwide now, are given Adderall or Ritalin, which I'm sure you guys are very acquainted with, which actually does the same thing, but it leaves a residue, and therefore many of the brain waves do not pass through for a long time. And it does change the charge in the fluid. So we are now obviously trying to work with a lot of our schools to stop the medications and use emotional intelligence as a way to remedy and retrain the brain without drugs. And in the 13 schools that we are at right now, 98% of our students actually stay in school and move from class to class. As you know, only 5% of foster kids actually graduate from high school and go to tertiary education. Having 98% actually graduate is a huge positive impact, and therefore Arnie Duncan and the Department of Education has just chosen us as the #1 educational program in the country. And we are now working with them to try and expand the program to many more schools. Of course, the economy hit. And so...
Jim, please come down to the DTC. Jim, please come down to the DTC.
See you later, Jim.
Next it'll be Marianne.
No, they'll take care of it.
So what we're trying to do now is actually create corporate consciousness. And we have our first meeting with all of the CEOs and chairs of Silicon Valley at my house. on the 8th of July. The Board of Equalization is the one working with us because, of course, everybody is afraid of not coming because the taxes might hit them harder. And so we had to manipulate a little bit to get some attention. But I really believe that now where corporate consciousness is needed because our country is bankrupt, we need corporations to adopt schools, adopt residential group homes, and really enable our children, who are the most needy citizens in our country, have a fighting chance.
Can't you move to Chicago?
I would like to.
Come here.
I would like to. I would like to actually talk to you guys. Michael Bloomberg is our partner in New York, and we've done a phenomenal job there. Cindy Lederer, who is our partner in Miami, who's the head of juvenile court there, has duplicated the program there, and we're looking to really come to Chicago and in Washington and other places and enable this program. And we have it all in actual program books that are easy to duplicate.
Really?
And we can train. We have trainers that go all over the country. And we would be able, and that's what I suggested, that Dr. Vicky Stevens actually comes here and goes through a training with you guys so that you can actually implement the same program, and we have all the best practices guideline. It's all monologued, it's all written. There's no, we are not possessive of it, on the contrary. Yeah. We are trying to enhance the program everywhere.
Yeah, I think Hephzibah was a good connection in a way.